The first scream ripped through the forest like a shotgun blast, sharp and unexpected, echoing off the tall pines and jolting every bird from its perch. And in that instant, I knew the HOA had finally pushed too far. Because they hadn't just trespassed on our land this time, they had stepped straight into Grandpa's territory, where every path was laced with traps older than the county itself, traps meant for boars and black bears, the kind that didn't give warnings but swallowed trespassers whole in a nightmare of splintered wood and sharpened steel. And as I stood on the ridge overlooking our camp, watching a cluster of self-proclaimed HOA cops in cheap uniforms and clipboards stumble through the underbrush with the arrogance of men who thought bylaws outranked bloodlines, I realized that no one, not the county, not the sheriff, not even God himself, could save them from what they had just triggered. Because Grandpa's land wasn't just a forest, it was a fortress, a breathing, snarling thing designed to chew up anyone foolish enough to think they could own what we had built here. And as the echoes of that scream faded into the rattling hush of leaves, my heart began to pound, not from fear, but from the thrill of knowing the game had begun. A game the HOA had started, but that Grandpa would finish with teeth bared and claws unsheathed. Because the men down there thought this was about dues and regulations, about tidy lawns and fences approved by a board. But what they didn't understand was that our family had lived on this land long before a subdivision appeared at the edge of the woods, long before the HOA came with their fine print and their power trips. And while they were busy policing mailbox colors and the height of garden fences, Grandpa was digging, hammering, rigging, carving death into the very roots of the forest, traps disguised as natural hazards, pits disguised as shadows, snares disguised as vines, all built for the boars that once tore through these woods with tusks like sabers. And though those beasts had dwindled, Grandpa never stopped sharpening his stakes, never stopped oiling his springs, never stopped baiting the ground with secrets no intruder would live to tell. And now the HOA cops, these petty enforcers who thought a laminated badge gave them authority here, were about to learn that when you trespass on land that has been baptized in sweat, blood, and bone, you aren't stepping into someone's backyard. You're stepping into a war zone, and as I crouched lower, hearing the confused shouts below, I saw the first of them, the stocky one with the reflective sunglasses and the walkie-talkie, stumble forward, his leg jerking violently as he disappeared into a hole disguised with leaves. A shriek tearing from his throat as sharpened spikes rose up like the forest itself had grown teeth, and the others spun around in shock, their smug faces blanching white as they realized this was no accident. And still above their fear, I could hear Grandpa's laugh somewhere behind me, low and rough, like gravel rolling downhill, because he had been waiting for this, waiting for the day when the forest would answer his call, and that day had finally come. Their boots scraped against pine needles as panic jolted through the group, some raising their walkie-talkies, others fumbling for the sidearms they weren't legally allowed to carry but strapped on anyway. A ridiculous costume of authority that looked less like law and more like boys playing sheriff. Yet even boys could bleed, and the pit made sure of it as the one who fell writhed and howled, his shin pinned against a spike that had snapped clean through muscle, blood darkening the soil beneath him, and the others, 4 of them, circled in hesitation, torn between dragging him out and pressing forward to prove some imaginary jurisdiction, and from where I crouched I could see their indecision melting into anger. Because the HOA never took embarrassment lightly, not when their power was challenged, not when the families they bullied dared to fight back. And that's exactly what Grandpa had done. Not with lawyers or ballots, but with iron teeth buried in the forest floor. And I thought of the stories he'd told me as a kid. Stories about when he was younger, when wild boars tore through these trees at night, uprooting saplings and trampling gardens. How he'd lost 2 hounds to a tusked monster that gored them before he could fire a shot. And how that loss hardened him, taught him that in this forest you built respect with blood. That if you didn't put your sweat into the soil, it would swallow you whole. And I remembered how his hands, scarred and steady, had guided mine as we whittled the first stakes, as we dug the first pits. How he'd whispered that traps weren't just for animals. They were for men, too. For the day someone came to take what was his, because there was always someone. And though I had thought he was paranoid back then, a relic of a harsher time, seeing the HOA thug stumble deeper into his kingdom made me realize he had always known this day would come. Always known that the men in suits and clipboards would eventually grow bolder. Trade paper fines for boots in the dirt. And as they shouted for backup into their radios, not realizing the dense pines blocked every signal, I almost pitied them. Because they had no idea that once you entered Grandpa's woods, you were cut off not just from the world, but from hope itself. And as the wounded man's screams thinned into ragged sobs, another one, tall and thin with a red cap pulled low, tried to skirt the pit, stomping wide around it, only to trigger the snap of a tripwire that sent a spiked log swinging down from the branches, a trap designed decades ago for charging boars, and it slammed into him with a crack that echoed through the trees, lifting him off his feet and hurling him into a bed of brambles, his breath knocked out, his ribs likely shattered, and the others froze, horror dawning across their faces as the forest itself seemed to lash out. And in that moment, the arrogance drained out of them like sap from a cut tree, because they realized this wasn't just trespassing. This was survival, and survival was something Grandpa never lost. One of them shouted, voice cracking with the kind of fear no training seminar could iron out. And though he barked orders to fan out and hold the line, I could hear the tremor in his throat, because he knew, deep down, that clipboards and fake citations didn't matter out here, not when the forest had teeth sharper than his courage. And I watched as they clung to procedure like drowning men clinging to driftwood, forming a shaky perimeter around their wounded, scanning the trees as if expecting us to charge them like bandits. But Grandpa didn't fight that way. No, he was patient. He was the forest itself, silent, watchful, waiting for mistakes. And the mistake came quickly when the youngest of the group, barely more than a kid with peach fuzz on his jaw, decided he'd prove himself by rushing ahead, stomping through ferns, muttering about how this was just old man scare tactics, and for a second I thought maybe he'd skirt the traps. Maybe blind luck would carry him through. But the forest doesn't gamble, it devours. And a sudden crunch beneath his boot snapped the silence, followed by the whiz of a counterweight dropping. And in a heartbeat, he was hoisted upside down by a rope snare, dangling like fresh bait as he flailed and cursed, his gun clattering to the ground, his face red with panic as blood rushed to his head. And the others surged forward but stopped short, terrified of triggering another mechanism, their courage fraying like old rope under strain. And I realized this was exactly how Grandpa had planned it. Traps not just to maim, but to terrorize, to peel back the bravado of intruders until all that was left was the raw, quivering flesh of fear, because once fear took hold, the forest didn't need to lift a finger. The men destroyed themselves trying to escape it. And I thought of the nights I'd spent as a child, curled in a sleeping bag by the fire, while Grandpa's voice wove through the crackle of the flames, telling me how his father before him had taught him the same art. How a good trap wasn't just wood and rope and steel, but psychology. How it whispered to the intruder's nerves until even silence became unbearable. And I wondered if these HOA cops had ever felt real silence before. The kind that presses down like a physical weight. Every chirp and rustle suddenly suspect, every shadow a predator. And as the dangling kid thrashed and sobbed, calling for his mother between curses, the others began to bicker, accusing each other of incompetence, of poor planning, their unity crumbling with every heartbeat. And from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Grandpa stepping out from behind a cedar trunk, his silhouette sharp against the twilight, his old hunting rifle slung casually over one shoulder, his other hand gripping the carved walking stick he never went without. And though he didn't speak, the sight of him, tall and gnarled like the trees themselves, sent a chill down my spine, because when Grandpa emerged, it meant the forest had already decided who belonged and who didn't. And the HOA cops, trembling and trapped, were about to find out which side of that line they stood on. Grandpa didn't need to raise his rifle. The weight of his presence alone was enough to freeze the trespassers in place, their eyes wide, their knuckles white around their useless radios. Because in that moment they weren't enforcers of bylaws or self-styled cops of a homeowners association, they were intruders on land that rejected them, children who had wandered into the wrong forest. And I could see it dawning on them as they shuffled backward, as if distance could undo what they had already triggered. But Grandpa wasn't about to let them retreat, not after years of their harassment, not after the fines they'd tried to bury us under, the threats, the notices nailed to our cabin door like declarations of war. And he stepped forward with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing the ground itself will fight beside you, his boots finding paths invisible to outsiders, his voice finally rolling out like thunder when he said, "This ain't your jurisdiction." And those words, though simple, hit like a gavel slamming down, final and inescapable, because no matter how many papers they waved, no matter how many signatures they carried, nothing they had could overwrite what bled in this soil. And one of them, the one with the shaved head and the cheap tactical vest, tried to puff his chest and shout back, tried to claim authority in the name of the HOA, but his words stumbled as another of Grandpa's snares snapped nearby, the sound like a gunshot, and suddenly none of them wanted to move. None of them wanted to test which step might be their last, and the silence that followed was thick with sweat and breath and terror, and though the wounded man in the pit kept groaning, his cries seemed far away, like the forest had swallowed them too, muffled them into the earth, and I watched as the tall one with the clipboard, the one who had seemed so smug at the subdivision meetings, fell to his knees trying to reason, his voice cracking as he offered deals, compromises, even apologies, words the HOA had never spoken before, and Grandpa tilted his head, squinting at him like he was studying an animal he couldn't decide whether to shoot or let run. And I realized with a chill that Grandpa had waited for this. Not just the confrontation, but the humiliation, the sight of the mighty HOA crawling in the dirt of his forest. And for the first time, I understood the full scope of his traps, not as defenses, but as a trial. A gauntlet designed to strip these men bare until they stood exposed before him, begging for mercy they didn't deserve. And the forest seemed to lean in, listening, as if the trees themselves hungered for the answer of what would come next. Grandpa's eyes, sharp as broken glass under the brim of his old hat, scanned the cowering men, and for a moment no one breathed. The forest itself holding its silence like a verdict waiting to be read, until finally the youngest one, the kid still dangling upside down from the snare, let out a pitiful sob that cracked the tension, his body swaying as he begged to be let down, promising he'd quit the HOA, swearing he never wanted to be part of this in the first place. And his raw panic split the others further, because the two still standing argued in frantic whispers, one hissing that they had to cut him down, the other insisting it was too dangerous, that every inch of ground was a landmine, and their bickering swelled until Grandpa slammed his walking stick into the dirt with a crack that made them both flinch like schoolboys caught stealing, and he said, in that voice that always seemed carved from stone, "This land ain't for sale, ain't for rules, and sure as hell ain't for trespassers." And the authority in those words broke whatever false confidence they had left, because one of them bolted, turning and crashing through the underbrush in blind desperation, ignoring the warnings of his comrades, and for a heartbeat I thought maybe he'd make it. Maybe panic would carry him past the snares and pits, but the forest had been waiting, and the sound that followed was like fabric tearing as he fell chest first into a bed of sharpened stakes. A trap older than me, disguised beneath a mat of moss, and his scream cut short into a wet gurgle that echoed just long enough to make the others' faces drain of all color, their eyes darting to the shadows as if the trees themselves were hunting them. And still Grandpa didn't raise his rifle, didn't fire a single shot. He just stood there, letting the forest deliver judgment. And the one with the clipboard finally snapped, throwing his hands up and yelling that this was illegal, that they'd call the sheriff, that lawsuits would rain down like fire. But even as the words left his mouth, his voice wavered, because he knew no call was getting out from here. No judge was walking these woods. And when he stumbled backward, tripping over a root, Grandpa finally moved, slow and deliberate, stepping closer with that stick tapping the earth like a metronome, his shadow stretching long in the fading light. And the two men left standing looked smaller with every step he took, their bravado stripped away until they were nothing but trespassers caught in a web too vast for them to understand. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the trees in blood-orange light, I realized Section 1 of this war wasn't about bodies or bullets. It was about fear, about showing the HOA that the land had teeth, and that once you trespassed into our camp, into Grandpa's kingdom, there was no walking back out the same way you came in. A gust of wind swept through the canopy, hissing through the branches like the forest itself was whispering. And it carried the copper tang of blood from the pit where the first man still whimpered, too weak to scream anymore, and from the bed of moss where the runner had fallen silent. And I watched the remaining two struggle to keep their composure, their knees trembling as their clipboards and radios seemed like children's toys in a battlefield they couldn't comprehend, and Grandpa, slow as a stalking wolf, closed the distance until his shadow fell across them, his voice low and steady as he said, "Every trap here was built with patience, with care, with the kind of work you boys wouldn't understand, because you think power comes from paper and meetings, but out here power comes from knowing the earth, from earning it, from bleeding for it." And though his words weren't loud, they hit harder than gunfire, and the taller of the two finally snapped, yanking his pistol free with a shaking hand, pointing it at Grandpa's chest. His lips pulled tight in a mask of desperation, and I felt my own heart seize because I knew the forest wasn't armored against bullets. But before he could fire, the ground betrayed him, the thin crust of leaves collapsing as another pit yawned open beneath his boots, swallowing him into a black maw lined with jagged stakes, his pistol discharging wildly as he fell, the shot cracking harmlessly into the branches overhead. And the scream that followed was short and final, leaving only one man left, the one who had tried to negotiate, who had begged on his knees, and now he was truly alone. His friends scattered across the forest floor like broken dolls, his body shaking as Grandpa leaned down, his lined face close enough that the man could see every scar carved by time and hardship. And Grandpa whispered, "Tell them, tell your board, your neighbors, your little kingdom of fences and fines, that this land eats what it's given, and it's already had a taste." And then he stepped back, letting the man crawl away, sobbing, stumbling, tripping over roots as he fled into the dusk. And I knew Grandpa let him live not out of mercy, but out of design, because a single survivor could spread more terror than a field of corpses. And as the forest swallowed the man's retreat, silence settled heavy again, broken only by the creak of the boy still dangling from the snare, his cries dwindling to exhausted whimpers. And Grandpa finally looked at me, his eyes burning like embers in the dark, and he said, "That was only the first wave." And in that moment I realized with a chill colder than death that the HOA wasn't done, that this was just the beginning of something far larger, and the forest, for all its traps and teeth, was about to be tested like never before. The man who stumbled out of the forest that night looked less like an officer of an HOA task force and more like a hunted animal. His shirt torn, his face streaked with blood and dirt, his eyes wide and glassy as he staggered into the subdivision's neatly paved cul-de-sac where porch lights flickered on and neighbors gasped at the sight of him. And though he tried to speak, tried to warn them, all that spilled from his trembling lips were fragmented cries about spikes, pits, and shadows that moved. Words that made no sense to men and women who had spent their lives manicuring lawns and polishing SUVs, but sense didn't matter, because fear clung to him like smoke. And within hours the whispers spread, first across the HOA board and then through every home in their kingdom of fences, until the story of a failed enforcement patrol turned into a rallying cry for vengeance. And by dawn the next day, 3 black SUVs idled at the forest's edge, their headlights slicing through the mist, their doors slamming as a dozen more so-called HOA cops stepped out, this time armed with shotguns, batons, and enough false bravado to drown the memory of their fallen comrades. And from our perch high in the ridge, Grandpa and I watched them assemble, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against the grip of his rifle. And though he didn't speak for a long moment, I knew what was running through his mind. The forest had taken its first bite, but now the enemy had grown desperate, and desperation made men dangerous, unpredictable, willing to burn everything just to feel like they had control. And as the new group fanned out, mapping the tree line with flashlights and spray paint, I felt my pulse quicken with the knowledge that Section 1 had only been the prologue, that the real war for this land was about to ignite, and that if the HOA thought Grandpa's traps were cruel before, they hadn't yet seen what he kept hidden deeper in the woods, where the real nightmares waited. They came in tighter formation this time, flashlights sweeping, radios squawking with code words that sounded official but carried no weight under the canopy where signal bars died. and I could see they thought numbers would make them immune. That a dozen men armed to the teeth could somehow bend the forest to their will. But what they didn't know was that Grandpa had spent years mapping every hollow, every ridge, every stream that cut like veins through the earth. And for every trap they spotted, like the spring snare one of them prodded with a stick before it could fire, there were 3 more lying silent, invisible, waiting, and I felt the forest almost holding its breath, savoring the tension of prey stepping deeper. Because here they weren't hunters, they were quarry, and Grandpa knew it. His eyes gleaming in the gloom as he whispered, "They're already lost," and as if on cue, one of the SUVs they had left, parked at the edge of the clearing, sputtered, its headlights flickering because Grandpa had drained the oil earlier, a trick he'd pulled when I was a kid to teach me how engines choke when you starve them. And the men cursed, distracted, 2 of them breaking formation to check it. And that was when the first real strike of this new wave came. A creak overhead followed by a thunderous crash as a weighted log trap, so massive it had taken us weeks to rig high between the pines, swung down and split their line, crushing one man outright and pinning another beneath its bulk, his screams sharp and raw. And the formation broke like glass, men scattering, their lights flailing wild beams across trunks that looked more like teeth than trees. And Grandpa didn't even flinch at the carnage, didn't fire his rifle, didn't move. Because this was never about brute force. It was about psychology, about letting them realize piece by piece that every step forward brought them closer to doom. And as one of them barked into a radio, swearing they'd call in county deputies, I knew the signal would never reach. Not with the jammers Grandpa had hidden in hollow logs, old military tech he'd bought at a surplus auction and tinkered with until the forest itself became a dead zone. And sure enough, their radios fizzed into silence, their bravado cracking as the reality settled in that they were cut off, surrounded not by men but by an ancient patience, by traps set in rhythms they couldn't predict, and panic began to gnaw at them like termites in timber. And once panic sets in, the forest doesn't even need to touch them. They destroy themselves trying to escape. But panic alone wasn't enough for Grandpa. He wanted them to feel the same crushing fear that had once stalked him in the jungles overseas, when he'd been younger, leaner, and forced to rely on nothing but instinct and cruelty to survive. And I saw that past flare in his eyes as he studied the scattering intruders, because every tree, every slope, every hidden line of tension wire was a chapter from his old playbook, repurposed for home soil. And though I had grown up thinking his war stories were exaggerated, maybe even the drunken ramblings of a man who couldn't let go, now I understood he had been rehearsing, planning, building toward this very inevitability, because Grandpa never trusted outsiders, never trusted government men, never trusted anyone who tried to take what wasn't theirs. And the HOA cops had made the worst mistake possible. They had declared war on land that breathed his name. And as the trapped man screamed under the log, another rushed to help him only to trip the snare wire disguised under a bed of pine needles. His body yanked skyward with such force, the flashlight flew from his hand and spun across the dirt, its beam swinging wildly as he thrashed like a puppet in a noose, his friends shouting, 2 firing their pistols into the darkness out of sheer terror, bullets tearing bark, sparks jumping from stones. But their wild shots only woke the deeper forest, crows bursting from branches in a shrieking wave that made the men duck, convinced they were under siege from all sides, and Grandpa chuckled low in his throat, the sound more chilling than any scream because it wasn't joy, it was memory. He'd seen this before. He knew how men broke, how order crumbled into chaos when fear stole their vision, and he leaned close to me and whispered, "Watch their eyes, boy. Watch how they stop looking ahead and start looking behind." And he was right. Their lights no longer searched the path forward, but whipped in frantic arcs, trying to find an enemy that wasn't even moving. Because Grandpa wasn't firing shots, wasn't charging them, he was letting the forest and their own nerves do the work, and sure enough, one of the bigger ones with a shaved head and tactical vest shouted that they should fall back. But when they spun around, the trail they came from was gone, swallowed by fog rising unnaturally fast from the damp creek bed. And though I knew it wasn't magic but Grandpa's smoke bombs, buried in clay jars that released a choking haze when tripped, the effect was the same: disorientation, blindness, the sense of being swallowed whole. And that was when the ground beneath them shifted, not by chance but design. Because Grandpa had tunneled shallow pits across that whole ridge, camouflaged with woven mats of leaves, and one by one boots found them, snapping ankles, twisting legs, dropping men into sudden hollows where sharpened stakes waited just shy of fatal but deep enough to wound, to bleed, to cripple, and their screams layered into a chorus of panic, the kind that no HOA meeting minutes could ever contain. And I realized then that this wasn't about trespassing. This was about violation, about men who thought rules and badges, even fake ones, gave them dominion, learning the hard way that here in this camp, in this forest, rules bent the other direction. And the law wasn't written on paper. It was carved in bark and bone, and Grandpa was the judge, jury, and if he wanted, the executioner. Yet even as blood stained the dirt and their formation dissolved into frantic shouts, one of them, a man with a scar across his cheek and eyes that didn't shake as easily as the others, kept his composure, barking orders, dragging one of the wounded clear of a pit, rallying the others with promises that backup was minutes away, though I could hear the hollowness in his voice, because deep down he knew no signal had gone through, no cavalry was coming. And Grandpa seemed to recognize it too, his smile tightening, his jaw set as though measuring whether to break this leader quickly or let him simmer longer. And he chose the latter, because intimidation worked better when the strongest link started to fray. So instead of striking him, Grandpa loosed the forest itself, pulling a cord that unleashed a cascade of stones down from the ridge, the noise deafening, the dust choking, and while it didn't kill anyone outright, it separated them again, scattering the herd. And in that chaos, the scar-faced man's confidence cracked for the first time, his voice rising as he shouted for them to regroup at the log where their comrade still writhed, pinned beneath its weight. But when they stumbled back there, flashlights cutting through haze, they saw the pinned man wasn't screaming anymore. He was silent, eyes glassy, blood pooled too wide for saving, and that sight, more than the traps, broke them because now it wasn't just fear. It was death, undeniable and permanent, lying heavy in front of them. And the silence that followed lasted only seconds before one of them snapped, bolting into the trees alone, firing blindly until his pistol clicked dry. And then the silence swallowed him too, the forest closing behind as though he had never been. And I realized Grandpa hadn't even moved from his crouch, hadn't fired a single round, hadn't needed to. Because everything was working exactly as he'd designed. Bleed them, scare them, disorient them, and let them destroy themselves. And when I whispered, "Shouldn't we finish it?" Grandpa's eyes flicked to mine, steel hard, and he said, "Patience is the sharpest blade. Let them cut their own throats first." And his words proved true seconds later when two of the shaken men turned on each other, arguing whether to press forward or retreat, shoving escalating to blows, until one struck the other across the jaw with his rifle stock, the crack echoing like a gunshot, and the group fully unraveled, unity shredded, their leader yelling over them but his authority dissolving, and that was when Grandpa finally shifted, standing tall, stepping into a shaft of moonlight so they could see him, just a silhouette, rifle across his shoulder, calm as stone, and in that moment I swear he looked less like a man and more like the forest itself given form. A warden they had trespassed against, and the way their flashlights trembled told me they felt it too, that they knew they hadn't just walked into traps. They had walked into judgment, and as the night deepened around us, the forest seemed to lean in, hungry for the verdict. The leader with the scar kept barking orders, but the forest no longer respected his voice, and neither did his men, their eyes darting not to him but to the shifting shadows and the silent figure of Grandpa, who stood with the weight of a century in his bones, yet somehow radiated more menace than the dozen guns pointed at him. And I felt my chest tighten as the scar-faced man finally gave the command to fire, bullets tearing into the night, sparks ricocheting off stone and bark. But Grandpa had already melted back into the trees, moving with an agility no man his age should possess. And I realized then that his years weren't a weakness, but a weapon. He had lived so long with war that it had carved him into something more than human, something elemental, and the forest was his exoskeleton, his weaponized skin, and the men firing wildly were just scratching at the surface of something they could never pierce. And one by one their barrels clicked empty. Hot brass littering the soil, and silence rushed back like a tide, broken only by the sound of their heavy breaths and the occasional whimper from the wounded. And that was when Grandpa struck for real, not with bullets but with presence, emerging just close enough to let them see his outline before vanishing again. His silhouette here, then gone, his footsteps masked by streams and soft earth, until they started turning their guns on each other by mistake. Convinced shadows were moving when it was only the wind. And in that frenzy, one shot tore through the leg of a man still tangled in a snare, his scream splintering whatever fragile control remained, and suddenly they were animals, not officers, not enforcers of some petty HOA ordinance, but cornered prey tearing each other apart, and Grandpa watched from a branch above, crouched like an old predator waiting for his trap to spring. And then I saw him move faster than I thought possible, dropping with a roll, dragging the scar-faced leader into a chokehold before the man could shout, pressing the rifle barrel under his chin. And for a moment everything froze, flashlights swinging onto the scene, illuminating Grandpa's lined face and cold eyes as he growled, "This forest doesn't belong to you." And though the men screamed and leveled their weapons, they didn't fire, because they knew if they did, their leader would die instantly, and that hesitation was all Grandpa needed, jerking the man forward, shoving him into one of the half-dug pits, the leader tumbling in with a howl, snapping bone as he landed on a sharpened stake. The noise so final it silenced even the crickets, and the rest of the men broke. Truly broke, dropping their weapons, scrambling into the fog, crashing into trees, tripping into streams, desperate to escape the forest that had become a labyrinth of death. And I almost pitied them because there was no way out they could recognize. Every trail booby-trapped, every ridge misleading, and as their flashlights dwindled into fireflies, swallowed by the dark, Grandpa turned to me, his expression unreadable, and said, "It's not over, they'll send more, they always do." And he was right. Because the next morning we heard the drones first, their buzzing unnatural in the still air, and then the crunch of heavier boots, vehicles forced as close as the dirt roads would allow, and these weren't the fake HOA cops anymore. These were real deputies, real uniforms, real rifles, men with radios that pierced even Grandpa's jammers. And for a moment I thought the tide had finally turned, that no matter how clever Grandpa's traps, the sheer force of modern law would crush us, but Grandpa only grinned, a feral grin that bared his teeth, and said, "Good. They'll bring the whole hive, and when you take the hive, the queen shows her face." And sure enough, behind the line of deputies rode a convoy of black SUVs, tinted windows, spotless paint. And from the lead one stepped a woman in a pressed blazer, clipboard in hand, her voice cold as she announced that she was the HOA president herself, here to enforce community standards. Her words so absurd in the shadow of corpses and shattered men that I almost laughed. But no one else did because the deputies flanked her, treating her authority as real, and it hit me then that this wasn't a rogue HOA anymore. This was something bigger, something tied into county officials, property developers, and law itself bent crooked. And Grandpa must have known it all along, because he didn't look surprised, only tired, as though some inevitable war had finally arrived on his doorstep. And when the president ordered her deputies to advance, to arrest us for acts of terrorism, Grandpa didn't argue. Didn't shout, he simply raised his rifle and fired once, the bullet splitting her clipboard in half, paper scattering like snow. And for a heartbeat everything held still, and then the forest erupted. Every trap Grandpa had left untouched now igniting in a storm, pits collapsing under armored boots, nets springing from above to haul deputies screaming into the air, spike lines whipping across the path to topple SUVs, tires exploding as sharpened caltrops bit into rubber, and the whole front line fell apart in seconds, chaos folding the neat ranks into a mess of bodies, and yet the president didn't flinch, didn't scream, only glared with eyes colder than steel. And I realized she was more dangerous than any soldier, because she didn't care how many she lost. She cared only about control, and she screamed to the survivors, "Burn the forest down!" And those words pierced me worse than any bullet, because suddenly this wasn't about men versus men anymore. It was about the destruction of everything that lived here. The trees, the streams, the animals, our camp. the legacy Grandpa had built from blood and soil, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, but for the forest, his forest. And without another word, he pressed a bundle into my hands. A map rolled tight, whispering, "Go north. Find the ridge. Don't look back. This fight is mine." And before I could protest, he shoved me, hard, sending me stumbling into the underbrush. His last glance a command not to waste the sacrifice. And I ran, choking on smoke as the first flames roared, the crack of gunfire behind me blending with the screams of men falling into traps and the shouts of others lighting torches. And even as I fled, I turned once to see Grandpa standing on the ridge, silhouetted against fire and chaos, rifle raised like a banner, his figure unmoving as the swarm closed in, and I knew then he wasn't fighting to survive. He was fighting to hold the line long enough for me to escape, for the forest to take one last breath of defiance. And as I stumbled north through ash and shadow, the map clutched tight. I realized this wasn't the end, but the beginning. Because the HOA had declared war on something older than themselves, and though Grandpa might fall, the forest had marked me as its heir, its next warden. And the men who thought they could claim land with rules and fines would learn the truth written in blood and bark. You cannot own the wild. You cannot tame it, and when you try, it consumes you whole. One trap, one scream, one flame at a time.